During an Easter service, a young boy, eyes glazed, pointed to the sky and shrieked with a voice that was not his own, "He's not coming any more!" Why did two choristers vanish that very night without a trace? And what unnatural harmony had echoed from the woods for weeks, even when the chapel doors were sealed shut? What do you think truly happened to those boys? Share your theories in the comments below. And if you're drawn to chilling mysteries and unexplained phenomena, subscribe to Host of Silence so you don't miss a single untold tale. To uncover the unsettling truth behind these events, we must journey back to Dallas, Texas, in the year 1863. The year 1863 cast a long, grim shadow across the American landscape, and even in Dallas, Texas, far from the blood-soaked battlefields of the East, the echoes of war reverberated through the very air. Life continued, albeit with a muted hum of resilience and a pervasive undercurrent of anxiety. It was within this fractured reality that Pastor Elijah Boone's Baptist chapel stood, a beacon of unwavering faith amidst the encroaching darkness. A man of 54 years, Pastor Boone carried the weight of a profound personal tragedy. The previous year, the insidious grip of cholera had swept through his home, claiming both his beloved wife and his only son, leaving him adrift in a sea of grief. Yet, from the depths of his despair, a new purpose had emerged, forged in the crucible of his faith. He had opened the doors of his humble chapel, not just for Sunday sermons, but as a sanctuary for the young souls displaced by the conflict. 12 boys, orphaned by the war, rescued from the ravaged fringes of a nation tearing itself apart, found refuge under Pastor Boone's benevolent care. They were a diverse assembly, ranging in age from 7 to 13, each bearing the invisible scars of loss, yet collectively striving for a semblance of normalcy. The chapel, a modest wooden structure with stained-glass windows depicting biblical scenes, became their home, its altar their stage, its pews their classroom. Under Pastor Boone's gentle guidance, they formed a choir, their young voices, though untrained, blending into a surprisingly harmonious chorus that resonated with the raw, untainted hope of childhood. The atmosphere within the chapel walls was one of quiet reconstruction, a fragile peace built upon shared sorrow and the comforting rhythm of daily prayers. Among the 12, 2 boys stood out, each in his own distinctive way. Jesse Miller, barely 11, possessed a voice of ethereal purity, a natural gift that set him apart. His sensitivity, a delicate membrane between himself and the harsh realities of the world, made him acutely perceptive to the subtle shifts in the chapel's aura, a trait that would later prove both a blessing and a curse. Caleb Dunn, 2 years Jesse's senior, was a quieter presence, his obedience a steadfast anchor in the often turbulent waters of boyhood. He moved with a deliberate calm, his eyes often downcast, absorbing the world around him with a silent intensity that belied his unassuming demeanor. Together, and with the other 10 boys, they formed a cohesive unit, their shared experiences binding them closer than blood. Their days were filled with lessons from Scripture, chores around the chapel, and the joyous, if sometimes off-key, practice of their hymns. For a time, it seemed as though the chapel had become an island of serenity, untouched by the tempest raging beyond its sturdy wooden doors. This fragile tranquility, however, was destined to be disturbed. The news of a new maestro, arriving from New Orleans, rippled through the small community of Dallas, reaching Pastor Boone's ears with a mixture of anticipation and a faint, almost imperceptible unease. Silas Merriweather was his name, a man of 39, whose reputation as a scholar of music preceded him. He arrived in Dallas one sweltering afternoon, his presence a stark contrast to the dust and weariness that typically clung to travelers. He was strikingly handsome, with piercing dark eyes that seemed to hold ancient secrets, and a charisma that radiated effortlessly, drawing attention without demanding it. His attire, though suited for travel, bespoke a certain refinement, hinting at a life lived beyond the humble confines of frontier Texas. He spoke with an educated cadence, his words carefully chosen, his mannerisms polished. Pastor Boone, ever the welcoming host, received Silas with the warmth of Christian fellowship. Yet, as the maestro began to speak of his past, a subtle discord began to hum beneath the surface of their conversation. Silas had indeed studied classical composition, but his interests, he revealed with a disarming smile, extended beyond the conventional. He spoke of spiritual harmony, a concept he described as the confluence of sound and soul, a deeper resonance that could be achieved through specific tonal arrangements and rhythmic patterns. He mentioned, almost as an aside, his extensive travels, particularly his time spent in the vibrant, mystical heart of New Orleans, where he had delved into the rich tapestry of Afro-Caribbean rituals. He spoke of their intricate drum patterns, their trance-inducing chants, and their unique understanding of the unseen world, all under the guise of academic curiosity. For Pastor Boone, a man whose faith was rooted in the rigid doctrines of Baptist tradition, these revelations stirred a nascent discomfort. He recognized the maestro's erudition, his profound understanding of music, but the mention of such practices, so far removed from the sacred hymns of his chapel, ignited a flicker of apprehension. It was a feeling he could not quite articulate, a premonition that something fundamental was about to shift. Silas, oblivious or perhaps indifferent to the pastor's unease, moved with an assured grace, his every gesture exuding confidence. He was not merely a musician. He was a presence, a force that seemed capable of reshaping the very air around him. The first rehearsal under Silas Merriweather's direction commenced the following morning. The chapel, usually filled with the gentle murmur of prayers or the innocent chatter of boys, now buzzed with a new energy, a palpable tension. Silas stood before the 12 choristers, his back to the altar, his gaze sweeping over them with an intensity that made some of the younger boys fidget. He did not begin with the familiar hymns, but with a series of vocal exercises unlike anything they had ever encountered, demanding a precision and a depth of resonance that stretched their young voices to their limits. His instructions were precise, his expectations high, and his methods unconventional. He spoke of the vibrations of the spirit, of aligning their internal energies with the external sound, concepts entirely alien to the boys' simple understanding of music. Jesse, with his inherent sensitivity, felt the change most acutely. He sensed a new current in the chapel, an undercurrent of something powerful and unfamiliar, stirring beneath the familiar solace of the sacred space. Caleb, ever observant, watched Silas with an unblinking gaze, his quiet obedience masking a growing curiosity, perhaps even a nascent fascination. The initial harmony that had defined the boys' choir began to subtly fracture, replaced by a strange, almost hypnotic unity enforced by Silas's commanding presence. As the notes filled the air, they seemed to twist and coil, no longer merely sounds, but something more, something intangible and potent. A quiet unease settled over the chapel, a heavy shroud that veiled the initial optimism. The boys, initially thrilled by the prospect of a new maestro, now felt an unspoken tension, a prickling sensation that hinted at a path diverging irrevocably from the one they had known. The legacy of faith, so carefully nurtured by Pastor Boone, now faced an encroaching shadow, its true nature yet to be revealed, but its ominous presence undeniably felt. The quiet routine of the Dallas chapel, once a bastion of predictable piety, began to unravel with an unsettling grace. The initial peculiarities noted during the Choirboys' rehearsals intensified, blossoming into phenomena that defied simple explanation. Pastor Elijah Boone, a man whose faith had been forged in the crucible of personal tragedy and rigid doctrine, found himself increasingly adrift in a sea of inexplicable occurrences. He had first dismissed the boys' unusual vocalizations as the strain of prolonged practice, or perhaps the lingering trauma of their recent past finding an outlet in uncontrolled expression. He spoke of fatigue, of the need for rest, his voice echoing with a forced conviction that even he could no longer fully embrace. But fatigue did not explain the transformation that overcame the young choristers. Under Silas Merriweather's poised, almost languid baton, their voices would shift. What began as the familiar hymns of the Baptist tradition would, without warning, contort into a symphony of alien sounds. They were not merely off-key or discordant. They were utterly foreign, guttural and melodic in turns, a cacophony of syllables that bore no resemblance to any known human language. Their eyes, once bright with youthful innocence, would glaze over, becoming distant and unfocused, like polished stones reflecting an inner void. A peculiar stillness would settle upon them, a trance-like state that rendered them unresponsive to the pastor's increasingly desperate calls. They moved with a disturbing, almost puppet-like precision, their chests expanding with breath that produced sounds of an ancient, forgotten tongue. Silas Merriweather, the enigmatic conductor from New Orleans, observed these transformations with an unsettling composure. There was no alarm in his gaze, no flicker of concern. Instead, a faint, almost imperceptible smile would often play upon his lips, a look of profound satisfaction that bordered on a chilling approval. His presence, once a source of comfort and artistic inspiration, now seemed to deepen the mystery, his quietude a stark contrast to the growing disquiet in the chapel. The very air around him seemed to thicken, charged with an unspoken understanding of the strange music that filled the space. The unsettling phenomena were not confined to the hallowed walls of the chapel. As dusk settled over the rural community of Dallas, a new kind of terror began to seep from the very earth itself. From the dense, whispering woods that bordered the settlement, polyphonic chants would rise on the night air. These were not the faint echoes of the boys' practice. They were robust, resonant voices, weaving intricate, often dissonant harmonies that drifted across the fields, chilling the very marrow of those who heard them. The sounds carried a distinct, unearthly quality, and what made them truly terrifying was the knowledge that the chapel, the only place where such a choir existed, was locked tight at those hours, its windows dark and silent. Shadowy figures, indistinct and fleeting, were increasingly sighted flitting through the tree lanes at the edge of the woods, or sometimes, closer still, darting between the humble homes of the townsfolk. They were never clear enough to be identified, mere blurs against the encroaching darkness, yet their presence was undeniable, leaving a lingering chill in their wake. A palpable sense of being watched settled upon the community, transforming familiar paths into stretches of unnerving vulnerability. More disturbing still were the physical manifestations of the encroaching strangeness. Crude, archaic symbols, never before seen in the region, began to appear carved deep into the bark of the ancient oak and pecan trees surrounding the chapel and the outskirts of the settlement. Their lines were sharp, precise, etched as if by a tool of unnatural keenness, and their meaning remained obscure, yet they radiated an aura of malevolence that spoke of rituals far removed from Christian piety. And then there were the birds. Dead birds, primarily crows and sparrows, began to be discovered, not scattered haphazardly, but meticulously arranged in perfect, macabre circles at the base of the marked trees, their tiny bodies twisted and contorted as if in silent agony. The sight of these grim arrangements sent shivers down the spines of even the most hardened frontiersmen, hinting at a perverse artistry that transcended the natural world. Among the choir boys, the signs of influence grew more pronounced, more individualized. Jesse Miller, the youngest and most sensitive, had been the first to exhibit the full extent of the bewildering changes. He began to utter pronouncements that were unsettlingly prophetic, his words cryptic and unsettling. He spoke of shadows that danced where light should be, of voices that sang from the earth itself, and of a coming darkness that would consume all. His eyes, though often glazed in rehearsal, would sometimes clear, only to hold an ancient, knowing look that was profoundly disturbing in a boy of 11. Caleb Dunn, typically quiet and unassuming, underwent a different, yet equally disturbing transformation. He became increasingly reclusive, his movements slow and deliberate, his gaze perpetually fixed on some unseen point in the distance. He would observe his surroundings, and especially his fellow choir boys, with an intensity that suggested a deep, internal processing, as if deciphering a puzzle that remained hidden to all others. His silence, once a mark of his gentle nature, now felt heavy, charged with an unspoken dread. Pastor Boone's faith, once an unshakable pillar of his existence, began to buckle under the relentless assault of the inexplicable. He preached with a renewed fervor, his sermons growing longer, more desperate, filled with increasingly fervent pleas for divine intervention. Yet, even as he spoke of God's protective hand, a creeping doubt gnawed at the edges of his conviction. He saw the fear in the eyes of his congregants, a fear that mirrored his own burgeoning terror. The familiar comfort of Scripture seemed to offer no solace against the creeping dread that now permeated every aspect of their lives. The residents of Dallas, a community accustomed to the harsh realities of frontier life, but ill-equipped for the supernatural, found themselves gripped by a pervasive fear. Whispers turned to hushed conversations, then to anxious gatherings. They sought answers from each other, from the pastor, from anyone who might offer a rational explanation for the unfolding madness. But there were no answers, only more questions, and the chilling certainty that their world was twisting into something unrecognizable. The approaching Easter, a time of renewal and hope, now loomed on the horizon not as a promise of salvation, but as an ominous marker, a date towards which the strange event seemed inexorably to build, hinting at a climax that promised to be as terrifying as it was inevitable. The air itself seemed to hum with a growing apprehension, a prelude to an unknown horror that awaited them. The air in Dallas, Texas, thickened with an ominous anticipation as Easter Sunday, 1863, dawned. It was the holiest day for the community, a time for joyous hymns and renewed faith, yet a palpable dread clung to the very stones of the chapel. Pastor Elijah Boone, a man whose steadfastness had been a beacon for years, was a fractured figure. His movements were jerky, his eyes wide and bloodshot, betraying a profound inner turmoil. He paced the sacristy, muttering prayers, his hands trembling as he clutched his worn Bible. The weight of the world, or perhaps something far more sinister, seemed to press down on him, threatening to crush the last vestiges of his composure. He was desperate, not just to lead his flock through the service, but to maintain the fragile illusion of order, to cling to the fading light of faith in the face of an encroaching darkness. He knew, deep in his gut, that something was terribly wrong, something beyond the usual anxieties of a man responsible for so many souls. The chapel filled slowly, a hushed reverence mixed with an undercurrent of unease. The usual warmth of the congregation was absent, replaced by a chilling silence that amplified every creak of the wooden pews, every whisper of the wind outside. The choristers, usually vibrant and full of youthful energy, stood unnaturally still, their young faces pale under the flickering gaslight. Silas Merriweather, the enigmatic choirmaster, stood at the podium, his back to the congregation, a figure of unsettling calm. His baton, usually a vibrant extension of his will, hung limply at his side. The service began, a desperate attempt at normalcy. Prayers were recited, their words hollow, echoing in the strained silence. Then came the hymns, meant to uplift, but instead they seemed to drag the very spirit downwards. As the congregation reached one of the most solemn hymns, a lament of profound sorrow and hope, a chilling transformation began. The melody, usually a source of comfort, became a discordant drone, each note a nail in a coffin. It was then, amidst the haunting strains, that Jesse Miller, the youngest and most sensitive of the choristers, stirred. His eyes, once bright with innocence, were now vacant, unfocused, as if peering into an abyss only he could see. A shiver ran through the chapel, a collective gasp held in countless throats. Slowly, agonizingly, Jesse rose from his place among the choristers. His movements were not his own, but controlled by an unseen, terrible force. He stood rigid, his small frame radiating an unnatural power that seemed to suck the air from the room. His arm, stiff and unyielding, slowly lifted, his finger pointing not at the cross, not at the ceiling, but straight upwards, as if piercing the very fabric of the heavens. Then, from his young throat, a sound erupted that was not Jesse's. It was a voice ancient and vast, a guttural roar that vibrated through bone and marrow, shaking the very foundations of the chapel. It was a scream born of primordial despair, laced with an unholy power that echoed in the deepest recesses of the soul. "He is not coming any more," the voice boomed, a declaration of ultimate abandonment, of a hope irrevocably extinguished. The words hung in the air, a death knell to every shred of faith and reason. Panic, raw and unbridled, erupted. A collective shriek tore through the chapel as people scrambled, overturning pews, stumbling over each other in a desperate attempt to escape the horrifying truth that had just been unleashed. Mothers clutched their children, their faces contorted in terror. Men, usually pillars of strength, became trembling wrecks, their eyes wide with incomprehension and dread. The solemnity of Easter had been shattered, replaced by an inferno of pure, unadulterated fear. The night that followed was a descent into an incomprehensible nightmare. Amidst the chaos and the desperate attempts to make sense of what had transpired, 2 choristers vanished without a trace. No struggle, no sign, just an eerie void where young lives had once been. Among the missing was Caleb Dunn, a quiet and obedient boy. Witnesses, their faces still pale with shock, recounted seeing him in the immediate aftermath of Jesse's outburst, walking slowly towards the dense woods bordering the chapel grounds. His eyes, they swore, were closed, his movements deliberate, as if he were in a trance, being pulled by an invisible, irresistible current. It was a vision that haunted those who saw it, a chilling premonition of irreversible loss. Pastor Elijah Boone was found later that night, not in his study or among his flock, but collapsed in a hidden corner of the chapel, near the altar. He was in a state of profound catatonic shock, his body rigid, his eyes staring blankly at some unseen horror. His lips moved, but no sound emerged, only a dry, rasping breath. His faith, once an unshakable fortress, was utterly annihilated, his sanity a shattered mosaic beyond repair. He remained in that state, a living monument to the unspeakable terror that had consumed him, a silent testament to a spiritual devastation so profound it rendered him incapable of speech or coherent thought. And then there was Silas Merriweather, the enigmatic choirmaster, who had stood so calmly as the world crumbled around him, simply disappeared. No note, no footprints, no clue. It was as if the earth had swallowed him whole, or perhaps, as some whispered, he had simply stepped back into the shadows from which he had emerged. His absence only deepened the gnawing mystery, adding another layer of unsettling questions to an already incomprehensible tragedy. The community of Dallas was left in an agonizing state of despair and utter confusion. The chapel, once a sanctuary of hope, became a place of dread, its very stones seeming to whisper of the unspeakable. The surrounding woods, once a source of childhood adventure, now loomed as a dark, hungry maw. A profound, inexplicable darkness had descended, leaving behind only the chilling certainty that something truly terrible had happened, something that defied reason, something that had torn the fabric of their world apart and left an unfillable void. The chilling whispers of the Dallas tragedy echoed far beyond the grief-stricken chapel walls, prompting a desperate, if belated, call for reason. Into this maelstrom of fear and superstition stepped Dr. Amos Redgrave, a man of science, a physician and researcher from Fort Worth, whose 46 years had been dedicated to the empirical and the verifiable. He arrived in Dallas not with a Bible, but with a firm belief in the mechanistic universe, convinced that every horror, no matter how profound, held a logical explanation awaiting discovery. Redgrave was a man of meticulous habits, his mind a finely tuned instrument of deduction. He was dispatched to Dallas with a singular, daunting mission, to rationalize the unspeakable. A scientific committee, hastily assembled and comprised of men equally committed to the tenets of reason, was placed under his charge. Their task was to dissect the remnants of the horror, to gather every scrap of evidence that might shed light on the inexplicable demise of the Choirboys and the unsettling events surrounding them. The initial phase of the investigation was methodical, almost clinical in its detachment. The committee's primary focus was the collection of tangible data. They meticulously scoured the chapel, the orphanage, and even the surrounding woods, searching for anomalies, for anything that defied the natural order. Among the most crucial pieces of evidence they managed to secure were the crude, unsettling recordings of the boys' final, terrifying chants. These were not mere melodies. They were described by the few who had heard them as a guttural, dissonant cacophony, a sound that seemed to predate human language, resonating with an ancient, primal dread. The committee also painstakingly collected biological samples, traces of blood, hair, and other organic matter found at the various sites associated with the boys' decline. Every fiber, every dust particle, was catalogued with the fervent hope that a microscopic analysis would yield the key to the mystery, perhaps a virulent disease, a rare toxin, or some unknown environmental factor. Dr. Redgrave approached these recordings and samples with a quiet confidence, certain that the answers lay hidden within the data, waiting to be unearthed by the rigorous application of scientific principles. He believed in the power of observation, the infallibility of the microscope, and the undeniable truth of chemical reactions. He envisioned a future where his findings would dispel the dark clouds of fear, offering a rational explanation that would soothe the terrified populace and restore order to a world seemingly undone by an unseen force. Weeks bled into a month, and the initial optimism began to wane, replaced by a gnawing unease. The biological samples, once promising, yielded nothing conclusive. No known pathogens, no unusual toxins, no discernible abnormalities in the cellular structures. The boys, it seemed, had simply ceased. Their bodies, though withered, offered no scientific clue to the cause of their rapid decline. It was as if their very essence had been consumed by an invisible fire, leaving behind only the husks of what they once were. But it was the recordings that truly began to fray the edges of Redgrave's composure. He had them transcribed, analyzed for patterns, for any discernible linguistic structure, but they defied all known forms of human communication. The sounds were deep, resonant, yet utterly alien. They seemed to vibrate not just in the air, but within the very bones of those who listened, stirring something ancient and unsettling. Redgrave spent countless hours in his makeshift laboratory, a converted warehouse on the outskirts of Fort Worth, listening to the chilling repetitions, his brow furrowed in concentration, his scientific certainty slowly eroding under the relentless assault of the inexplicable. Then, disaster struck, swift and merciless. One cold, moonless night, a fire erupted at Redgrave's laboratory. The flames consumed the building with terrifying speed, reducing it to a smoldering ruin. All the painstakingly collected data, the biological samples, the meticulously catalogued notes, and every copy of the horrifying recordings. All were lost, swallowed by the inferno. The cause of the fire remained a mystery, officially attributed to a faulty lamp, but whispers persisted of something far more sinister, a force that sought to erase the very evidence of its existence. It was a cruel, almost poetic end to the scientific pursuit, as if the unknown itself had risen to claim its secrets. The loss of his life's work, coupled with the relentless, maddening exposure to the recordings, proved to be Redgrave's undoing. He had, against the advice of his colleagues, subjected himself to prolonged listening sessions, convinced that immersion was the only path to understanding. He would sit for hours in the darkened laboratory, the strange, guttural chants filling the air, echoing in the confined space, twisting around his thoughts. The sounds seemed to burrow into his very being, dismantling the rational framework of his mind piece by piece. He began to exhibit strange behaviors, muttering to himself, his eyes wide and unfocused, haunted by visions that only he could perceive. One morning, his assistants found him huddled in a corner of the charred remnants of his laboratory, rocking back and forth, chanting in a low, guttural voice that eerily mimicked the very sounds he had sought to explain. The words were incoherent, a jumble of primal sounds and fragmented scientific terms, a terrifying testament to a mind that had shattered under the weight of the inexplicable. Dr. Amos Redgrave, the man of science, the beacon of reason, was ultimately institutionalized. His sanity irrevocably broken by the sounds that defied all logic, all understanding. The asylum became his final, desolate laboratory, where his experiments continued only within the confines of his tormented mind. The fire and Redgrave's subsequent madness only deepened the pervasive dread that clung to the story of the Dallas Choirboys. The questions, once whispered, now screamed in the silence of unanswered prayers and abandoned hopes. Where had Silas Merriweather, the enigmatic maestro, truly vanished? His disappearance remained a gaping wound in the narrative, a phantom presence haunting every inquiry. And why, with a chilling predictability that defied all medical explanation, did every single survivor of that choir, every boy who had merely witnessed the events, succumb to an early death, none living beyond their 25th year? A silent, invisible curse seemed to cling to them, ensuring that the horror would not merely fade but would continue to claim its victims for decades to come. But the most disturbing question of all, the one that lingered like a cold breath on the back of the neck, was this: who taught those boys to sing something that neither man nor beast, nor even the celestial choirs, dared to repeat? The melodies, if they could even be called that, were not of this world, not of this time. They hinted at an ancient, malevolent knowledge, a secret whispered from the very abyss of existence. Not even science could explain it. And perhaps it never should have. The chilling tale of Dallas's Choirboys, shrouded in the dust of time and whispered across generations, leaves us with a profound unease. It's a stark reminder that some dissonances in our world cannot be harmonized, no matter the unwavering faith of a pastor, the enigmatic genius of a maestro, or the rigorous inquiry of a scientist. Perhaps the true horror lies not in the malevolent entities themselves, but in the terrifying realization that our human understanding, our logic, and even our most steadfast beliefs can crumble when confronted with a darkness that utterly defies explanation. Was it the echoes of forbidden rituals, the corruption of innocent voices, or simply a tear in the very fabric of reality that consumed them all? We are left to ponder what truly became of those souls, and whether the whispers of that eerie music still resonate in the quiet, forgotten corners of Dallas, a testament to a truth too terrible to grasp. What are your thoughts on this unsettling chapter from 1863? Do you believe it was a case of demonic possession, a scientific anomaly, or something far more ancient and sinister at play? Share your theories and interpretations in the comments below. And if you dare to explore more tales of the unexplained and the terrifying, be sure to hit that subscribe button and join our community. Until next time, stay vigilant, for some shadows never truly fade.